The day my daughter-in-law threw hot coffee on my chest, I thought nothing could hurt more than that, but I was wrong. Very wrong. Because, before the burn had cooled down, I discovered something that blew the ground out from under my feet. My son, my boy, had been deceived for years while supporting her secret life with another man. And it all started with that no that I finally had the courage to say. The no that she never accepted. The no that tore off her mask and destroyed the lie she called marriage. If I had known what I was about to discover that day, I would have held that cup with both hands. But fate had other plans. That morning, I was just stirring the sugar in my teacup, the way I've always done for years. The kitchen was quiet, just the sound of the spoon tapping on the porcelain and the old clock on the wall telling the time. It was one of those simple moments that you learn to appreciate as you get older, you know? The house in silence, the smell of tea, the light coming through the window. I thought it would be just another ordinary day until I heard the door slam as if someone had brought a storm from outside. Emily stormed into my kitchen like a hurricane. No good morning. No, how are you? Nothing. Just her hurried heels on the floor, her purse thrown over the chair, and the irritated look of someone ready for a fight. I still remember the way her eyes swept across the kitchen, as if nothing there mattered, as if I were just a piece of furniture. She walked to the table, placed her hand firmly on it, and said, dryly, I need your card now. Just like that. No beating around the bush. No respect. For a second, I even thought it was a joke. Silly me, I still have this habit of trying to see the best in people. I smiled slightly, stirring my tea, and asked, a card? Why the rush, Emily? She didn't laugh. She didn't soften. On the contrary, her eyes narrowed, hard, impatient, as if I were interfering with her plans. That's when I felt a chill run down my spine. That wasn't the voice of someone asking for help. It was the voice of someone used to giving orders. She repeated it more slowly, as if she were talking to a child. I need your card. Each word dripped with arrogance, as if I were obligated to obey. I took a deep breath, smelled the tea rising, and tried to stay calm. At my age, you learn that responding in kind rarely solves anything. So I spoke simply, firmly, without raising my voice. No, Emily. My card is my responsibility. If you need anything, talk to me. But the card, no. And that's when her face hardened in a way I'll never forget. The silence that followed that sentence felt heavy. I could even hear the ticking of the clock at its loudest. Her eyes burned, as if I had just committed a crime. She wasn't used to hearing no, much less from me. For years, I had given in, swallowed my pride, turned a blind eye to avoid conflict with my son. But that day, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps out of instinct, the words simply slipped out of my mouth. And I swear, it was as if I had lit a match near a gallon of gasoline. Without any warning, she grabbed the coffee cup from her hand and, in a swift movement, threw the liquid towards my face. I only had time to feel the heat cutting through the air. The coffee hit my chest, my neck, and splashed onto my chin. It was hot, bitter, and aggressive. My blouse was soaked, the tablecloth stained, the floor dripping brown. For a second, I thought my heart would leap out of my chest. It wasn't just the coffee that burned. It was the humiliation. It was the disrespect. It was the certainty that she no longer saw me as a person, but as an obstacle. I remember the exact sensation, the fabric clinging to my skin, the strong smell of burnt coffee mixed with the overly sweet perfume she was wearing. My hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from shock. I looked at her, expecting anything, an apology, a gesture of regret, and I overreacted. But all I saw was a crooked smile, almost of satisfaction, as if she had finally put me in my place. In her mind, an elderly lady saying no needed to be forcibly corrected. The entire kitchen seemed to hold its breath. I couldn't even hear the clock anymore. It was just the sound of her heavy, panting breath, like an animal that had just attacked. I stood there, holding the spoon still inside the teacup, my chest wet, feeling every drop trickle down. And do you think she came to help me?
No.
She just crossed her arms and repeated coldly, "Now you understand that I'm not asking, I'm warning you." At that moment, it wasn't just the coffee that had spilled. It was the last drop of respect. I could have screamed. I could have told her to get out of my house. I could have fought back, thrown whatever was within my reach. But instead, something much quieter happened inside me. An old, tired, and wounded part of me awoke. I saw myself years ago, being raised to swallow everything so as not to cause family problems. I remember the times I closed my eyes to her rudeness, just to avoid seeing my son in the middle of a conflict. And suddenly I realized my silence had fed that monster. As I slowly wiped the coffee from my neck with a napkin, I felt a strange mix of pain and clarity. It wasn't just about a thrown cup. It was about everything that came before. The jokes, the disdainful glances, the veiled insults, the decisions made without consulting me within my own home. The cup was just a symbol, the culmination of something that had been accumulating for years. And as painful as it was to admit, I was also the one who had let it get to this point, with my fear of losing my son. I looked at Emily one more time, deep down, and saw something I hadn't noticed before. She wasn't afraid of me. She had no respect for me, and she truly believed she could do whatever she wanted without any consequences. I took a deep breath, kept my voice low, and simply said, "You've just crossed a line from which there's no turning back." She laughed. She thought it was just old drama, overreaction. My son, down the hallway, heard everything and didn't say a word. But that's a story for another time. As soon as I finished wiping the hot coffee from my skin, I looked up, searching for my son. He was there, standing in the hallway, like a silent shadow. His eyes didn't meet mine. They were fixed on the floor, as if the tiles had suddenly become more interesting than his own mother, all dirty and trembling. The first thing I felt wasn't pain, nor anger. It was a loneliness, so profound it seemed to fill the entire kitchen. His silence weighed more than the coffee that dripped down my neck. He took a hesitant step, but not to help me, to approach Emily. That hurt. It still hurts to remember. I saw the way he touched her arm, as if she were the victim of that absurd scene. Emily, of course, took advantage. She made that expression she masters so well. The teary eyes, the short breath, the hand on her chest, feigning shock. My son swallowed it all. Every gesture, every silent lie. He believed her, and not me. I tried to speak. I swear I tried. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come out. Not because I was afraid, but because, deep down, I knew that nothing I said would be heard at that moment. His mind was already completely shaped. Emily had put down roots there. And roots, when they grow crooked, are hard to pull out. I felt small. Not because of my age, not because of my wrinkles, but because of the powerlessness of seeing my son trapped with someone who diminished him while he believed he was being loved. Emily turned to him and said, with the calm of someone who knows how to manipulate situations, "She provoked me. She always does this." I felt my stomach churn. My son took a deep breath, but didn't answer. He just looked away, as if he wanted it all to end quickly. As if I were the nuisance in that story. I had seen that kind of reaction before. In men who get used to abuse, who surrender to emotional control, who find it easier to blame the weakest link than to confront the real problem. With each passing second of that silence, I remembered who he once was. The boy who ran around the yard with scraped knees, showing me crooked drawings and saying they were gifts for me. The teenager who hugged me tightly when I cried missing his father. The man who promised me, one day, that he would never allow anyone to disrespect me. He was there, but it was as if he had disappeared within himself. I felt the ground grow cold beneath my feet. Not from the spilled coffee, but because for the first time, I understood that losing a child isn't just about death. It's about someone taking their mind, taking their values, taking the love they had for their own family. Emily hadn't just taken the house. She had taken him. And his silence was the most painful proof of that. I didn't need him to shout for me. I didn't need him to defend me like a hero. I just wanted one word. When he finally opened his mouth, it wasn't to ask if I was okay. It wasn't to find out why my chest was burning or my clothes were wet. He just said, "Let's go, Emily." With that simple, cold phrase, he pushed me out of his own life without realizing it. Emily smiled, not at him, but at me. A victorious smile, as if to say, "See? He's on my side." And that pierced me deeper than any cup of coffee could. I took a step back, still holding the towel I'd used to dry myself. The air felt heavy, as if the kitchen had shrunk. I wanted to call his name. I wanted to say, "My son, look at me." But the words wouldn't come out. Maybe because I knew he wouldn't hear me. Maybe because I needed to see with my own eyes how much I had missed. Emily walked past me, deliberately bumped my shoulder, and whispered softly, "Next time, think before you say no." They headed towards the door. My son looked back for a second, a tiny second that felt like an eternity. I wanted to find the child I raised in that look, but I didn't. I only saw tiredness, confusion, and fear. Not fear of me, fear of her. And that was the last straw that made me understand that the problem wasn't just the spilled coffee. It was the emotional prison he was in. A prison he didn't even know he was a prisoner of. The door closed. Silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a silence that screamed. A silence that tore at me from the inside. I stood there, cloth in hand, tea cooling on the table, trying to understand how everything had reached this point. And little did I know that this silence would only be the beginning of something even more painful and revealing. I spent the rest of that day with the bitter taste of coffee still clinging to my skin, as if her aggression had left an invisible mark. I sat in my old armchair, the one that had molded my body over the years, and thought about everything that had happened. Emily never did anything without a reason. She didn't waste energy on something that didn't have some advantage behind it. And that desperation for my card, that smelled like a big problem, the kind that creeps in slowly but ends up overwhelming everything. Emily always had a strange relationship with money. I noticed it from the beginning. Back when she was still pretending to be sweet, she'd casually drop comments like, "Wow, so-and-so got a new cell phone from her husband, huh? Too bad your pension is so low. You should invest more in your appearance, mother-in-law." Everything, absolutely everything, revolved around money, status, or what she could get from someone. She followed money like a dog follows the scent of food. It was impressive and terrifying. I remember when she and my son were still dating. She always found a way to push some expense onto him. The gas, dinner, expensive gifts, her credit card payments, and he, poor thing, thought he was being a gentleman. I already saw the pattern, but I kept quiet. "It's just a phase," I told myself. But phases pass, habits remain. And in her case, each temporary loan became a permanent debt, and each debt became another excuse to ask for more. The request for the card that day wasn't new. It wasn't the first time. The difference is that before, she came with that practiced little smile, with that sweet voice she uses when she wants to seem innocent. "Mother-in-law, can I use your card to take care of something quickly?" And I, afraid of conflict, afraid of losing my son, ended up giving in. Never for large amounts, but enough for her to feel she could use me, and enough for my son to think it was normal. But over time, I noticed a pattern. Her urgencies always coincided with some extravagance. When I saw her on social media, she was at the spa, then at the salon, then buying a new bag, then getting those expensive massages that promise miracles. I'm not stupid. I never have been. I always mentally noted everything, just observing. And every detail told me one thing clearly. Emily didn't want a credit card. She wanted an open safe. What put me on alert that day was her gaze. It wasn't ordinary irritation. It was panic. It was desperation, as if she were about to lose something or someone. Something inside me, something that only age gives you, told me that this urgency had nothing to do with household bills. It was something big, something that demanded money immediately. Her hand trembled slightly, and when Emily trembles, Emily lies. That has always been the sign. I tried to remember the last strange conversations I overheard between her and my son. The whispers in the living room. The calls she always answered on the balcony. The messages she hid by turning her phone face down. And suddenly, like a puzzle putting itself together, everything started to make sense. The aggression wasn't about no. It was about control. She needed the card because she had lost control elsewhere, and would use any means to regain it. The cruelest thing of all is that Emily always treated me like I was a naive old woman, clueless about everything. As if I spent my days talking to plants and knitting, completely oblivious to her intentions. And I let her believe it. Because sometimes, my dear, it's better to be underestimated. It's in the moment when they think you're not seeing anything that you see everything. I started mentally reviewing the recent strange expenses that appeared on my bills when I still let her use the card, temporarily. There was one transfer I never understood. An unfamiliar name. A larger amount than usual. At the time, I thought it was some kind of bank error. Now, I wasn't so sure anymore. And when a woman like me starts putting the pieces together, well, there's no going back. It's like shining a flashlight in a room that's been dark for years. The cup of coffee thrown at me had been an attack, yes. But it had also been a clue. A clue that she was hiding something big, and that I had just ruined some plan. I felt it in my bones. Your body speaks when the truth is nearby. And that night, even before opening the computer, before starting to investigate, before discovering the unknown man's name, I already knew that card wasn't for her. And it was only a matter of time before I found out why. I spent the whole night reliving the scene in my head, like a movie you try to turn off, but it keeps playing on its own. I lay in bed, but the smell of coffee seemed to linger on the pillow, as if reminding me of what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily's look of contempt, my son's cowardly silence, and that horrible feeling of being alone in my own house. And it was there, in that darkness, that something inside me began to change, slowly but surely, like earth cracking after years of drought. For years, I was the kind of mother who would do anything to keep the peace. I swallowed insults, let rudeness slide, smiled when I wanted to cry, and pretended not to see when Emily treated my son like a puppet. I had a rule for myself. I don't want to lose my son. That phrase guided me for so long that it became a part of me, like an old scar you don't even feel anymore. But every rule has a limit, and mine had been teetering on the edge of the abyss for a long time, without me realizing it. As I tried to sleep, I remembered so many things I had let slip by. The first time she called me nosy, the time she mocked my clothes in front of her friends, the day she complained about the food I spent hours preparing. And behind all these situations, there was always the same silence from my son. A silence that I previously justified as he's tired or he doesn't want conflict. But that night, for the first time, I saw that silence for what it truly was, emotional abandonment. What hurt me most wasn't the coffee, the shouting, or the arrogant request for the card. It was his expression, that lack of reaction, that way of looking at the floor, like someone who had already given up the fight. I saw the reflection of a broken man, molded by years of manipulation. And as painful as it was to admit, I realized that I had contributed to it by remaining silent. Prolonged silence does that to us. It corrodes, it makes us sick, it transforms us into shadows of ourselves. I got up in the middle of the night, walked to the kitchen, and turned on the light. The teacup was still there, with the sugar accumulated at the bottom. The coffee-stained towel hanging on the chair looked like a war flag. I stared at it all, feeling a tightness in my chest that seemed to beg to be heard. It was then that the truth hit me like a blow. It wasn't Emily I was allowing to dominate my life. It was fear. The fear of losing my son, when, in practice, I had already lost him a long time ago. The house was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I sat at the table, rested my hands on it, and closed my eyes. I had lived too many years not to recognize when a woman reaches her limit. That was mine. And curiously, there was no anger, no despair, no screaming. What there was a profound calm, the kind that comes after an internal storm that lasted decades. A calm that seemed to say, enough is enough. I touched the stained towel. The rough fabric scratched my fingers, And in that small gesture, I understood that humiliation only hurts as long as we accept it in silence. The coffee hadn't been the problem. It had been the symbol, the end point, the boundary crossed. And, realizing this, I felt something rekindle inside me. It was small at first, like an ember, but it grew larger and larger as I breathed deeply. That was courage. That kind of courage that only appears when self-love finally conquers fear. As the clock struck 3:37 a.m., I whispered, "I'm not going to be silent anymore." The words came out so naturally that they echoed throughout the entire kitchen. It wasn't a promise made on impulse. It wasn't a pretty phrase to console myself. It was a decision. A heavy, mature, necessary decision. I knew that from then on, nothing would be the same. Because when a woman my age decides to stand up, no storm can bring her down again. And that's when I realized the next step needed to be taken. I was going to find out what was behind that desperate request for my card. I was going to follow that trail, however painful it might be. Not out of anger towards her, but out of the love I still had for my son. And for myself. And little did I know that this silent investigation would completely change our lives. After that early morning when I decided I wouldn't stay silent anymore, I spent the whole day with a different weight on my chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't submission anymore. It was determination. The feeling was almost physical, as if something inside me had finally woken up after years of slumber. I walked around the house organizing things, but my mind wouldn't leave Emily's insistent and aggressive request for my card. That hadn't been a whim. It wasn't an impulse. It was desperation. And when someone desperate asks for money, there's always a hidden reason. I sat down in front of the computer, that old but faithful machine that had accompanied me through so many organized accounts, improvised spreadsheets, and conversations with my son back when he could still listen to me. I opened the bank statement with slightly trembling hands, not from fear, but from the feeling that I was about to see something that would change everything. The older we get, the more we learn to listen to that unfailing sixth sense. And mine was screaming, "Something's wrong here." The first thing I noticed were small transfers. Low amounts, almost imperceptible, like feathers falling to the ground. But accumulated feathers add weight. There were also withdrawals made at strange hours, like 2 in the morning, 3:30, 5, and 10 in the morning. Times when nobody makes normal purchases, much less household payments. My heart sank. That wasn't how I used the card. It never was. And deep down, I already knew who had made those withdrawals and why. I kept scrolling down. Purchases appeared in cosmetic stores, aesthetic clinics, expensive restaurants, things I had never bought. Emily always said she would pay later. But that later never came. And I, afraid of conflict, let the waters accumulate, like someone who ignores cracks until the wall collapses. But that day, for the first time, I was looking at every detail with the clarity of someone who has finally opened their eyes. That's when a different name appeared. A masculine name. It wasn't a store name. It wasn't a company name. It wasn't any service I knew. A simple, common name, but completely foreign to my world. The first time, I thought it was a bank error. The second time, I didn't think so. The third time, I felt a chill in my stomach that only those who have suspected the truth know. It was a direct transfer. To a real person. Someone who wasn't part of our family. I clicked on the record to see the details. The time, the amount, everything there screamed secrecy. A big, dirty secret that she was trying to sweep under the rug at the expense of my money and my silence. I remembered her face that day, the almost animalistic urgency with which she asked for my card, as if the world would end if she didn't get it. Maybe that was it. Maybe the world she had built was about to crumble. And I had put the first crack in it when I said no. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to remember all the times I'd seen Emily whispering on the phone, always moving away to the back of the house. The messages she hid by turning her phone face down. The outings she said were quick. The excuses repeated too often to seem true. And, little by little, the puzzle came together. Each piece fit into the others in a cruel way. The card wasn't for paying the electricity bill, or medicine, or groceries. It was for someone I didn't yet know. But one thing I was already certain of: if I continued following that trail, I would find something that would explain everything, including my son's silence. Because his silence was the symptom, not the cause. Emily was the cause. And that unknown name on the bank statement, it was the loose thread in the fabric she had stitched together with lies. All it took was pulling hard enough for everything to unravel. I took a deep breath, opened a new tab in my browser, and started typing the stranger's name. I didn't know what I would find. I didn't know where it would lead me. I only knew that, for the first time, I was ready to face the truth, however painful it might be. Because the love for a child gives us courage even when life tries to diminish us. And I still had no idea that that name hid a secret capable of destroying everything my son believed in. The enter key was still sinking under my finger when the first search appeared on the screen. At first, nothing out of the ordinary. Deleted profiles, incomplete records, addresses that didn't match. A common name, the kind that could belong to anyone or no one. But I've learned, through life, that secrets never appear out in plain sight. They like to hide behind simple things, precisely to go unnoticed. And the more I clicked, the more that name seemed to swarm where it shouldn't. I opened a list of old social media accounts, the ones almost nobody uses anymore. I flipped through page after page, feeling my heart slowly quicken, like someone approaching a door they know is locked, but also knows the key exists. Suddenly, a photo loaded. Small, blurry, but clear enough to make my chest clench for a few seconds. It was Emily. Emily and him. They weren't hugging, but they were too close to be just acquaintances. Her expression, that different smile, it wasn't the smile she gave my son. I brought my face closer to the screen, as if that could bring the truth closer too. It was a restaurant. A glass of wine on the table. Her hand on the table and his hand on top holding it. Those hands said more than any caption. And, for a moment, I felt a mixture of shock and deep sadness. My son, my boy, was being deceived while he thought he had found love to rebuild his life. And I, who had always tried to protect him from the world, hadn't been able to protect him from his own wife. I continued scrolling down the page. There were other photos, not many, but enough to tell a silent story. Some taken in different places, on different days. Exchanged smiles. Prolonged glances. Small touches. Nothing scandalous, of course. Emily wasn't stupid. But, for a woman my age, none of that needed explaining. The body speaks. The eyes speak. The chemistry screams. And the chemistry between them was impossible to deny. I opened another tab and searched his name in a public database. Simple address. Nothing luxurious. A distant, modest neighborhood. Nothing that matched the expensive life Emily claimed to deserve. I thought, what would make a woman so obsessed with status, aesthetics, and luxuries get involved with a man who clearly couldn't afford any of that? And the answer came like a snap, because he didn't need to. She had my son for that. My stomach churned. It was like ripping the blindfold off someone you love, and discovering they were never blind, they just didn't want to see. I remembered the times Emily spoke softly on the phone, using that sweet voice she never used with me or my son. I remembered the outings she said were with a friend. I remembered the sudden disappearances. Everything made sense, like a puzzle that just needed the centerpiece. And the piece was right there in front of me. I looked again at the first photo. The way she tilted her head toward him, the way he looked at her, nothing about it was innocent. I felt a warmth rise in my chest, but it wasn't anger. It was a calm, mature indignation, the kind that doesn't explode, but builds a purpose. I was no longer dealing with a difficult daughter-in-law. I was dealing with someone who was destroying my son while smiling at him at the dinner table. I clicked on another link, and this time I found something that made me grip the table tightly. An old post captioned, "Some encounters change everything." The photo was cropped, clearly to hide someone. The framing was strange, as if the person next to them had been erased. But the colors, the lighting, I recognized it instantly. It was the same restaurant as in the photo Emily appeared in. The same table. The same glasses. My heart pounded. Too fast to be a coincidence. Too small to be ignored. And it was there, in that instant, that the phrase echoing inside me was confirmed. The card wasn't for her. It was for him. It was to support a parallel life, hidden, fueled at my son's expense. And just thinking about it made my hands tremble, but this time not from weakness, but from a strength I didn't even know I still possessed. I closed all the tabs, took a deep breath, and let the silence of the house envelop me. The discovery had been cruel, but necessary. The truth hurts, but lies kill slowly. And I wouldn't let my son die emotionally at her hands. Not anymore. I had seen enough to understand that my research was only beginning, because discovering the man behind the transactions was only the first part of the storm that was yet to come. And little did I know what I would find next would stir my heart even more, and the destiny of our family. When I turned off the computer, I stood there for a while staring at my own reflection in the window pane. Sometimes seeing yourself at times like that is worse than seeing any exam. I saw myself tired, yes, but also lucid, and that hurt more, because I realized, with cruel clarity, that my son wasn't just in love, he was trapped. And not trapped by true love, but by a slow, silent, and dangerous emotional dependence that Emily had been nurturing since the first day she laid eyes on him. My son has always been a man with a heart that was too big for his own good. After his father died, I watched him wither. He became more needy, more insecure, even more affectionate, as if he were afraid of losing anyone who showed him attention. Emily came into his life during this phase, and she knew exactly what to do. She praised him, touched his arm gently, smiled in that studied way, everything timed to fill the hole in his chest. And it worked. It worked so well that sometimes I wondered if she herself hadn't studied his emotional map before entering our lives. I remember the first family dinner. She made a point of holding his hand the whole time. Not out of love, but to mark her territory. Every time I said something, she would look at him before answering, as if she wanted to control every gesture, every word. And my son, oh, my son melted. He believed that was affection, dedication. But I saw something different in her eyes. Possession, not love. It was never love. Over time, he changed. Slowly, but he changed. He started apologizing for everything, for being late, for forgetting things, for his opinions. He would shrink away in simple situations, as if he were always afraid of displeasing me. He started talking to me less. He started asking permission for things he used to do naturally. And when Emily complained, he would apologize for breathing. I tried to talk to him, tried to start a conversation, tried to win my boy back, but it was like trying to rescue someone who is sinking while smiling and saying everything is all right. The most painful part was realizing that he defended Emily even when she was clearly wrong. If she yelled at me, he'd say she was stressed. If she insulted me, he'd say it was just a joke. If she humiliated me, he'd say I was exaggerating. And every excuse he gave for her was like a shovelful of dirt being thrown into the coffin of my relationship with him. But I swallowed it all, because, at that time, I still thought my silence was a form of love. When I tried to talk to him about Emily's strange behavior, he looked away, as always. I remember his expression like it was yesterday, a mixture of tiredness, fear, and denial. He said, in a voice too low for his age, "Mom, you just don't like her." That pierced me like a knife. It wasn't just an accusation. It was proof that he no longer trusted me. Emily had settled between us like a wall, and he didn't even realize he was helping to build it brick by brick. But the worst part was when I tried to show him the first signs of the suspicious transactions. I was scared, yes, but more scared for him than for myself. I sat next to him on the sofa and showed him the computer screen. He barely looked. He said it must be some kind of mistake. He said Emily would never do something like that. He said I was making things up. He said I was jealous. I remember feeling a physical pain, like someone had punched me in the chest. My son, the boy I raised, thinking that I was jealous of his own wife. I could have given up right there. I could have let it go, like I did so many times before. But something inside me wouldn't let me. Maybe it was a mother's instinct, maybe it was fear of what was to come, maybe it was the simple, painfully feminine feeling of knowing I was right. And the more he defended her, the clearer the web he was trapped in became. Emily had done what manipulative people do best: isolate and snare, seduce and take. I heard their bedroom door slam that night. The sound echoed throughout the house, heavy, weary. I was alone in the living room, silent, staring at the empty sofa where he had sat minutes before. And it was then that I understood. His love wasn't blind. It was kidnapped. And I would have to face not only Emily, but the world she had built in his head. And the hardest part was still to come, revealing the truth without losing my son forever. In the following days, while I tried to digest everything I had discovered, I observed the small things I had previously ignored. Every gesture of Emily's, every mood swing, every silence from my son seemed to carry a different weight now. It was as if the cup of coffee had opened my eyes to a reality that had always been there, but that I insisted on not seeing. And the more I looked, the clearer it became. This hadn't been a sudden outburst. It had been a pattern. An old, corrosive, and carefully hidden pattern. The way she entered my house that day, without asking permission, said it all. Emily never saw me as a mother-in-law. She saw me as an obstacle. She always had this arrogant attitude of someone who believes she deserves everything without ever having worked for anything. And my son, emotionally fragile, became the perfect ground for her to plant her own ambitions. But it was only after coffee that I realized the physical aggression wasn't gratuitous. It was a tool, a method, a silent but clear message: I do what I want and nothing happens to me. I started remembering other situations that at the time I minimized, like the time she pushed my son during an argument and then said it was nothing. Or when she broke a glass on the table during dinner just because he disagreed with her opinion. Or, even worse, when she slapped his arm because he took too long to reply to a message. I saw these things happen, but I convinced myself they were just moments of stress. Today I realized they were rehearsals. Rehearsals for something much bigger. And what scared me most when revisiting those memories was realizing that my son always accepted it, always stayed quiet, always lowered his head and apologized. I thought that was patience. Today I know it was fear. Fear of her. Fear of losing the little affection he thought he received. Fear of being alone again. Emily knew exactly where to press. She knew he grew up without his father, that he carried an open emotional wound. And she used that as a weapon, not as support. And with me she was always worse. Because I represented something she couldn't control: memory, history, truth. I was the living reminder of who my son was before her. And people like Emily hate anything they can't manipulate. That's why, over time, she began to treat me with disdain. It started with biting comments. Then came the indirect jabs. Then the outright rudeness. The coffee was just the first physical blow, but not the first emotional one. While organizing the kitchen cupboard, days after the incident, I began to realize that Emily was never afraid of me. She despised me, contempt accompanied by the arrogant certainty that no one would do anything against her. And why would they? She knew my son obeyed her, that he never confronted her, that he was afraid of losing her. And in the end, she believed that this would paralyze me too. She bet that my love for him would keep me silent forever. But she forgot one thing: mothers endure everything until someone messes with their children. And someone was messing with my son in such a profound, cruel, calculated way that that cup of coffee became a symbol. A warning. A line she crossed thinking I would remain the same silent old woman. But no. The coffee, hot and bitter, not only burned my skin, it also burned the fear that kept me prisoner. One of the following days, I heard Emily yelling at my son in the hallway, shouting, humiliating him, telling him to shut up. And he once again obeyed. My hand clenched on its own, as if my whole body was reacting without my permission. And there, listening to that aggressive voice, I realized something even more serious. That woman was destroying his spirit. And if I did nothing, I would lose my son forever. Not to her, but to the pain. It was there, in that instant, that it truly clicked. The coffee incident hadn't been an isolated event. It had been a summary of everything. A summary of their relationship. A summary of how she treated those who couldn't fight back. A summary of the silent monstrosity that I myself helped keep alive when I closed my eyes, when I remained silent, when I accepted the unacceptable. And that's when I decided the truth needed to come out. And that I would do it, even if in the process it tried to destroy everything around it. Because coffee was just the beginning. That night, after hearing yet another of their arguments echoing through the hallways, almost like a warning from fate, I sat alone in the kitchen. It was always there, in that small, old room, smelling of antique wood, that the important decisions of my life took place. The house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than usual. It wasn't the calm silence of a quiet night, it was a tense, heavy silence, like holding your breath before something inevitable happens. The spilled coffee still stained the towel, hanging on the chair. I didn't wash it on purpose. I wanted to look at it and remember what was really at stake. I touched the cloth with my fingertips. It was rough, dry, almost stiff with so much crystallized sugar. That stain wasn't just coffee. It was a physical reminder of everything I had allowed to happen inside my own home. And in that instant, I felt the weight of the question I had been avoiding for years. Until when? I slowly got up, went to the hallway mirror, and looked at my own face. I saw new wrinkles, I saw tiredness, I saw marks that time had left, but I also saw a strength I had forgotten existed. A strength that age doesn't erase. A strength that only appears when someone tries to take away what you love most. And in that reflection, I realized that, although Emily had taken a lot, peace, respect, space, she hadn't taken one thing: my courage. I went back to the kitchen and sat down again. I picked up my old notebook, the one where I always wrote down bills, reminders, and recipes. But that night, it would have another use. I opened it to the first blank page and began to write down everything I remembered. Every strange thing Emily did. Every suspicious expense. Every silence from my son. Every feeling that had crossed my mind since the day of the cup. And as I wrote, I realized that my hands were no longer trembling. It was as if, finally, I was organizing not only facts but also my own soul. After finishing what I remembered, I made the decision that had been circling in my thoughts since the moment she threw the coffee on me. I knew that just talking wouldn't help. Trying to appeal to her conscience wouldn't help, because she didn't have one. Asking my son to see wouldn't help, because he couldn't see while he was emotionally trapped. So I did what Emily never imagined a week-old woman, as she saw me, would have the courage to do. I decided to compile a dossier. I got up, walked to the computer, and turned on the screen. The blue light illuminated my face, and in that instant, I felt something inside me click into place. I was never a police officer, never an investigator, but I've been a mother my whole life, and mothers notice things that no one else sees. I opened folders, organized screenshots, recorded dates, saved receipts. I made notes. I connected the dots. Each click felt like a hammer blow to the wall she had built between me and my son. With each suspicious transaction I uncovered, each hidden photo, each detail, the sense of purpose grew within me. Emily thought I was just a naive, distracted old woman, easy to manipulate. But little did she know that when a woman my age decides to stand up, she stands up with the strength of all the pain she has swallowed in her life. And I had swallowed too many years. I closed one of the documents and took a deep breath. The decision was made. I was no longer a spectator. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer the woman who lowered her eyes to avoid fights. I had changed my own rule. And now I was ready to face the truth and expose whatever was hidden. The most ironic thing is that I made that decision in the exact same kitchen where Emily tried to humiliate me. In the same place where she thought she would silence me. But it was there, in that small space, smelling of tea and dried coffee, that I found my voice again. And little did I know that this dossier, these pages, these records, this evidence, would be the beginning of a revolution within our family. A revolution that would inevitably come to light and destroy every lie she had built. I sat down again at the table, with my computer open and a steaming cup of tea beside me, not for tranquility, but for focus. The clock was almost midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. It couldn't come. It was as if every cell in my body understood that this night wasn't for rest, but for revelation. The air was heavy, dense, charged with an energy I hadn't felt in years. An energy of purpose, of struggle, of motherhood. I started by reviewing everything I had saved in the previous days. Every screenshot, every bank statement, every strange message. I put everything in order, one piece at a time, like someone assembling a complex and emotionally dangerous jigsaw puzzle. It wasn't just about putting facts together. It was about piecing together wounds. And as I dragged the files across the screen, I realized how much more calculating Emily was than I had imagined. Nothing about her was impulsive. Not the spilled coffee. Not the expenses. Not the excuses. It was all part of a cycle of manipulation so cold it was chilling. I printed the first stack of documents and placed them on the table. The noise of the printer filled the kitchen as if it were a ritual. Each falling sheet represented a lie dismantled, a mask torn off, a truth pushed out of the shadows. I ran my fingers over the still warm sheets and felt my heart clench, not for myself, but for my son. He had no idea of the web he was trapped in, and I was about to show him everything in a way he couldn't ignore. I opened a new folder on the computer and started organizing everything by category: transactions, photos, messages, deposits, names. I wanted it so that when he saw it, it would be impossible to raise any doubts. I know my son. He has always tried to see the best in people, even where there is none. I needed to present evidence so clear, so direct, so objective that even the blindest heart would be forced to see. When I found the photo of Emily with that man again, I enlarged the image until it was almost blurry. The touch of their hands, the crooked smile, the glances, nothing there was innocent. "She never loved you, my son," I murmured to myself, my voice aching in my throat. It wasn't bitterness. It was pain. A pain that only a mother feels when she realizes someone is breaking her child while he smiles, believing he is loved. I grabbed my phone and started piecing together screenshots of old conversations I'd had with my son. Moments when he said Emily was different, or when he seemed sad but pretended everything was fine. Today, looking back, I realized it was a disguised cry for help. And I hadn't listened. Not as I should have. This made tears threaten to fall, but I held them back. It wasn't time to cry. It was time to act. As I organized everything, I began to notice an almost perfect timeline. Moments when she overspent coincided with moments when my son was most emotionally fragile. She drained his money while also draining his spirit. It was a cruel symmetry, calculated. And the more I saw, the clearer it became that my silence had been the greatest gift she could have received. But that gift was gone. The silent old woman was dead. I decided to print everything. Absolutely everything. The printer worked for long minutes, spitting out sheets as if vomiting the truth that had been hidden for so long. When I turned it off, there was a pile of documents, so large it looked like a court case file. I looked at it and felt a strange sensation. Pride. Not for exposing Emily, but for finally defending my son from something he couldn't see. I placed all the papers inside a thick folder. A red folder that I had been saving for years, waiting for some important use. And if this wasn't important, nothing else would be. I closed the folder firmly and for a few seconds just stared at that object on the table. It seemed heavy, and it was. Not only because of the paper, but because of the impact it would have. I knew that, when I handed that folder to my son, nothing would ever be the same again. And even so, I felt peace. A deep, solid peace. The kind that only comes when you do what is right, even if it hurts. The clock struck 3:14 a.m. I took a deep breath and said to myself, now there's no turning back. And the strangest thing is that, at that moment, I still had no idea how that folder changed. Sunday arrived with a strange silence in the air, the kind that seems to hold the world by the edge. I woke up before sunrise, as I did when my son was still small. I calmly set the table, arranged the white tablecloth I only use on special occasions, and left each plate meticulously aligned. It wasn't just dinner. It was a silent tribunal, a ritual, a farewell, or perhaps a rebirth. I still didn't know which of the two. The smell of home-cooked food began to fill the house. I made my son's favorite dish, the one his father used to cook on happy days. I wanted him to feel something familiar at that dinner, something that would remind him of who he used to be, before Emily molded everything around him like fresh clay. As I stirred the pot, I felt my heart beat faster, not from fear, but from responsibility. I was about to turn the key in his life, and nothing seemed more urgent than that. I placed the red folder on the table, but not in plain sight. I strategically left it on the sideboard in the corner, like a shadow waiting for the right moment. It was curious how that small object seemed to occupy the entire room. I felt its presence behind me all the time, as if reminding me of why that dinner needed to happen. I touched the cover for a moment, and the coldness of the plastic seemed to pierce my fingers. "It's today," I whispered to myself. When I heard the car pulling up in front of the house, my legs went weak. The old part of me, the one that always swallowed insults to keep the peace, tried to pull me back. But the woman I'd become after the coffee incident remained firm. I opened the door before they even knocked. Emily got in first, wearing that fake smile she used as emotional makeup. It was a practiced, calculated smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of someone who came expecting something, but not what I had prepared. My son came right behind me, thinner than I remembered, with deep dark circles under his eyes and a look that pierced my soul. He tried to smile at me, and I tried to smile back, but there was an invisible barrier between us. A barrier built with silence, manipulation, and pain. Yet, a mother's love found a way to break through it. I touched his face gently. He lowered his eyes, as he always did when trying to hide a sadness he couldn't explain. We sat down at the table. Emily praised the food as if reciting a rehearsed text. My son murmured thanks. The atmosphere seemed normal too normal. And this artificial normality gave me even more certainty that, if I left the situation as it was, nothing would change. Emily would continue to control his life. He would remain trapped. And I would continue to lose my son day after day, piece by piece. We ate in silence for a few minutes. I observed Emily's every gesture, every glance, every microexpression. She seemed uncomfortable, restless, as if she sensed that something in the atmosphere was out of place. And it was. There was a huge, heavy truth sitting at the table with us, and she didn't know it yet. My son, poor thing, was just trying to keep the peace, as he always did. He had no idea that this fragile peace was about to be shattered. When dessert was finished, I placed a spoon on the plate and took a deep breath. The soft sound of metal on porcelain echoed throughout the room. Emily raised an eyebrow, suspicious. My son looked at me with concern, and before anyone could say anything, I stood up, walked to the sideboard, and picked up the red folder. I walked back to the table with slow but firm steps. I placed the folder in front of her. Not in front of him. In front of her. "This here," I said, with a calmness I didn't even know I possessed, "is everything you've been doing behind my back. And worse, behind my son's back." Emily's face froze. Her smile vanished instantly. Her hands, so quick to point and command, became motionless. My son's eyes widened, as if he were seeing a ghost. And the silence that filled the room, it was the kind of silence that precedes storms. And deep down, I knew what was about to happen would change our lives forever. It would aria and destroy everything Emily had built with so much venom. Emily stared at the folder as if it were a bomb about to explode. The silence was so dense it seemed to fill every corner of the room. I could hear her shallow breathing, the slight tremor in her fingertips, the stiffness of her shoulders trying to maintain an air of superiority. My son, on the other hand, seemed lost, looking at the folder as if afraid of what he might find inside. And, for a few seconds, nobody moved. It was as if time had decided to stop and watch. "Open it," I said, my voice low but firm. It wasn't a request. It was a command, one I myself would never have imagined giving months ago. Emily hesitated. Her eyes narrowed, analyzing every detail of my face, as if trying to figure out if it was a bluff. But there was no more room for doubt. She knew. I knew. And my son was about to know. With trembling fingers, she reached for the folder's cover and carefully opened it, as if fearing to find something irreversible. The first page was there, a printed photograph, clear enough to eliminate any excuse. Emily. And that man. At the restaurant. Hands intertwined. Intimate smiles. A simple, yet devastating record. It was at that moment, at that exact second, that I saw her mask begin to crack. Her eyes widened just a little, very little for someone who didn't know her. But I knew her. I knew every nervous tick, every micro-expression she tried to hide. Her left eyelid twitched, the corner of her mouth tightened, and her breath caught in her throat. She tried to swallow hard, but the saliva simply wouldn't come down. The body betrays you before the mind can even invent a lie. My son leaned forward, pulling the folder slightly to get a better look at the photo. And I saw the exact moment his world began to crumble. He blinked several times, as if trying to push the image away, as if it were just an illusion. His shoulders slumped, his expression went blank, and his breathing became uneven. It was like watching a wall collapse in slow motion. Part of me wanted to touch him, hug him, protect him. But I knew this had to happen. He needed to see it for himself. Emily tried to close the folder, quickly, desperately. But I grabbed her hand before she could. And in that touch, she discovered she was no longer dealing with the old woman she thought she could manipulate. It was another woman. A woman who had finally woken up. "Keep reading," I said, looking directly into her eyes. She tried to look away. I wouldn't let her. She flipped through the second page. More photos. She flipped through the third. Printed messages with dates and times. On the fourth, there were the bank transactions. And that's when despair took shape. Her hand began to sweat. She gasped for air, as if someone were squeezing her chest. And, even though she was a good liar, she couldn't continue flipping through without trembling. My son watched everything in silence. Each page seemed to hit him like an icy wave. When he saw the first transfer to his lover's name, his eyes filled with involuntary tears. He didn't cry, not at that moment, but the pain was there, blatant, raw, impossible to hide. I saw his face contort, as if reality were striking him mercilessly. And that broke my heart into pieces. Emily tried to say something, but no words came out. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish pulled from water. For the first time since joining our family, she was speechless. Without justification. Without manipulation. Everything she had ever controlled was slipping through her fingers. And despite everything, despite years of swallowing insults, despite the cup of hot coffee on my chest, I felt no pleasure. I felt no revenge. What I felt was the same thing a mother feels when she sees her child fall and can't hold them. Pain. A deep, silent pain that comes from knowing that someone you love has been deceived so cruelly. Emily turned the page once more, but this time her hands trembled so much that she dropped one of the papers on the floor. My son looked at the fallen document. Slowly, as if seeing that sheet there off the table represented the point of no return. He bent down, picked up the paper, and when his eyes scanned the lines, something inside him broke completely. And it was there, in that small moment, in that simple gesture, that her mask completely fell off. My son stood there for a few seconds with that paper in his hand, motionless. It seemed as if the world had stopped around him, and in a way it had. I watched his gaze sweep over every line of the transfer, every penny sent, every date that coincided with moments when he believed Emily was busy, sad, needing space. His breathing became heavy, noisy, as if he were trying to pull air into a chest that simply wouldn't expand anymore. "This here," he murmured, almost voicelessly, as if he were hearing himself for the first time. "This here, what is it, Emily?" The tone wasn't angry, not yet. It had something far worse. Disbelief. The destruction of someone who still wants to believe the lie but can't anymore. Emily, sitting across from him, opened and closed her mouth desperately, searching for an excuse to wear. but no outfit fit. Nothing she said would be appropriate at that moment.
She tried to speak.
I can explain. But her voice failed. It was weak, small. Unlike the woman who stormed into my house like a hurricane. My son lifted his face, and when their eyes met, I saw the shock etched on her face. He was no longer the submissive man he always was. Not at that moment. Blind love had just opened its eyes. He placed the paper on the table with an unsettling calm. That calm that only appears when the pain is too great to turn into a scream. I knew that expression. I saw the same one in his eyes when his father died. It was the expression of someone who sees an entire world crumble in seconds and knows there's no way to rebuild it the same way. His hands began to tremble. Not from anger, from loss. "You betrayed me?" he asked, his voice breaking into notes, so thin they sounded like shattered glass. Emily tried to deny it. Of course she tried.
She cried.
She clutched her chest. She said it wasn't what it seemed. She said it was a mistake. She said I was confused. She said absolutely everything, except the truth. Every word she spoke felt like a shot against her own credibility. And my son heard it all. But he didn't believe a word. He ran his hands over his face, trying to compose himself. But tears streamed down his face without permission. Tears of shame, of frustration, of wasted love. That's when something inside me broke too. I wanted to hug him, cup his face in my hands, tell him everything would be all right. But I couldn't interrupt that moment. He needed to see who was standing before him, who Emily really was. When he raised his voice, and he never raised his voice, Emily froze. "You lied to me," he shouted, finally releasing years of pent-up pain. The sound echoed through the house like thunder. Emily recoiled in her chair. He stood up so quickly that the chair slammed against the floor with a dry thud that made my heart race. But I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The truth had finally been unleashed. "You used me," he said, pointing to the pages scattered across the table. "You used my money. You used my house. You used my love." His voice trembled. "And while I thought I was building a family with you, you were building another life with another man." Emily tried to approach him, but he took a step back. It was instinctive. He recoiled like someone who sees a venomous animal approaching. And that was what really broke her. For the first time, it wasn't me saying no. It was him, my son, the man she thought she controlled. He looked at me, and in that look was a silent apology and a silent plea for help. It was the saddest and most beautiful union I've ever seen on that face.
He didn't need to speak.
I understood. I always understood. I always understand. I am a mother. Emily started screaming, saying that it was just friendship, that it wasn't really like that she was vulnerable. But my son wasn't listening anymore. He hadn't just seen the evidence. He had finally seen her. And that sight hurt more than any photo, bank statement, or message. He sat back down, but this time he slumped against the backrest, his hands covering his face. His whole body trembled. His heart shattered before my eyes, like a thin shard of glass falling to the floor. And the only thing I could do was stay there, steady, present, holding my own pain so I could hold his when he was ready, because the worst was yet to come, and the silence that filled the room after that scream was only the beginning of the real storm. After that moment when my son collapsed into the chair, the house plunged into a silence so profound it seemed almost alive. It wasn't the usual silence of a room after dinner. It was a silence that carried weight, history, pain, and truth. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking away each second, tick-tock, tick-tock, as if announcing the death of something that would never return. Emily sat motionless, her face pale, her eyes wide, and her breath caught between fake sobs. My son, on the other hand, seemed to have aged years in just a few minutes. He stood there quiet, his face buried in his hands, his back rising and falling unevenly. It was like seeing a child crying inside the body of a grown man. And that, my God, that cut my soul. I wanted to approach him, but I felt that this moment belonged to him. It was the instant he was facing his own shattered life, and no one can hold someone's hand at that moment. The fall is internal. Emily tried to stand up, perhaps to touch him, perhaps to initiate some new dramatic performance. But before she could take 2 steps, my son raised his hand in the air, without looking at her, and said, with a firmness I had never heard before, "Don't touch me." The voice came out low, but so firm that the whole room seemed to tremble. Emily froze on the spot. She sat back down. This time without pose, without mask, without control. He took several deep breaths. I knew he was trying to gather strength to keep from falling again. When he took his hands away from his face, his eyes were red, gleaming with a bitter mixture of anger, sadness, and shame. The silence was so absolute that I could hear the sound of a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. He looked directly at Emily, and that look said it all. It was the look of someone who had finally seen who was standing before him.
She tried to speak.
Love, but he cut her off immediately. Don't call me that.
It was dry.
It was harsh. It was the kind of phrase that closes internal doors that never open again. The silence returned. This time, more suffocating, more cruel. Emily looked away, unable to face her own work. My son stood up slowly and placed his hands on the table, as if he needed support to avoid collapsing completely. Every movement of his seemed laden with pain. When he finally managed to lift his body, he stood still for a few seconds, breathing deeply, as if trying to stabilize the world around him. Then, he did something I'll never forget. He looked around the whole house. He looked at the walls, the window, the floor littered with scattered leaves. He looked at me for a brief moment, and there was immense guilt there. Not for having been deceived, but for not having believed me before. I responded with a motherly look, saying without words, "I will always be here." Emily started crying loudly, or pretending to cry loudly, seeking attention, trying to regain control of the situation. But this time no one was falling for her act anymore. The crying sounded fake, exaggerated, rehearsed. And the silence of the house only made it more evident. It was as if the entire environment was rejecting that performance. My son, still without looking at her, said in a low but sharp voice, "Sit down." "I'm not finished." She sat down, like a defendant before a judge, and I stayed where I was, sitting at the other end of the table, watching, feeling the weight of history rearranging itself there in that room. The quiet that filled the house had something almost spiritual about it. As if, finally, the truth had found space to breathe. As if all the words swallowed for years were there, hovering in the air, ready to be released. Emily looked around nervously, realizing that this was the first time she had no power over my son. The first time she wasn't in control. The first time the silence didn't favor her manipulation but condemned her. My son took another deep breath and, his eyes fixed on the papers, began to ask questions. Simple questions. Questions that any innocent person would answer without fear. But Emily stammered, looked away, clenched her hands, twisted her fingers, invented disjointed, meaningless phrases. It was like watching a castle crumble, brick by brick, while its own architect desperately tried to stop it. With each hesitant answer she gave, the house grew even quieter. It was as if the walls were listening, waiting, witnessing. And I knew that when that silence ended, nothing would ever be the same again. Because the next move would change everything. The silence remained so thick it almost seemed like a curtain between us. My son stood there, resting one hand on the table as if he needed that piece of wood to keep from collapsing again. Emily, sitting across from him, seemed to shrink with each passing second, as if the very air was draining away what little strength she had left. And I, sitting there, watching everything, felt something deep stir within my chest. It was pain, yes, but it was also pride. Pride in the man my son was finally becoming before my eyes. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he always made when he needed to make an important decision. I recognized that movement since he was a child. When he was afraid, when he was confused, when he needed courage. And there in that familiar gesture, I knew that something inside him had broken, and at the same time, something was being born. Emily tried to speak once more, attempting to regain her former composure. Honey, let me explain.
It was just a mistake.
I was vulnerable. But my son finally raised his face, and his gaze cut through hers like a blade. There is no vulnerability that justifies this, he replied, his voice firm but low. This here, he pointed to the scattered evidence, is not a mistake. It's a pattern. Emily's expression changed. The crying stopped. The tears vanished so quickly they seemed never to have existed. And there, in that microsecond, I saw the real Emily again.
Cold. Calculated.
Irritated that the charade hadn't worked. She took a deep breath, crossed her arms, and said, "You're exaggerating. This isn't a reason for all this." My son let out a short laugh.
Sad.
Painful. One of those laughs that hurt more than tears. He turned to me, and his eyes, my God, his eyes held everything at once. Regret, shame, gratitude, and pain. "Mom," he began, but his voice failed him. He swallowed hard. He tried again. "I'm sorry." My heart tightened.
He didn't need to say it.
But they did. And it pierced me like a silent embrace. Emily stood up abruptly, as if the conversation were ridiculous. "Look, this doesn't change anything. I'm still your wife, and you owe me respect." He turned to her with a chilling calmness, the kind of calm that only comes after the soul reaches its breaking point. "I don't owe you anything," he said, and I swear the air in the room changed at that moment. Emily laughed, a mocking, nervous laugh. "So that's it? You're going to believe her? That old woman who always manipulated you against me?" But my son did not waver. He did not stray. He did not tremble. He simply replied, "The one who manipulated you was yourself." It was at that moment that I saw something break inside Emily, not from regret, but from loss of control. She tried to approach him, but he took 2 steps back. And that retreat was the final sentence. She knew. I knew. He knew. Their story had ended there. Not because of me. Not because I asked. Not because I influenced it. But because he saw it. Finally, he walked to the bedroom, opened the wardrobe, and pulled out her suitcase. The old red suitcase she used when she wanted space to visit friends. This time, the space would be real.
Permanent.
He placed the suitcase on the bed and began, without saying a word, to fill it with her clothes, carelessly, without affection, without hesitation. Each piece thrown in was a chapter closed. Emily followed after him, screaming, crying, begging, threatening. It was all mixed together, like someone trying to save not love, but control. "You'll regret this. I'm going to destroy you both. You can't do this to me." But my son didn't look back. He slammed the suitcase shut, walked through the living room, opened the front door, and set the suitcase down outside. Emily was red-faced, her face contorted with rage. "It's over," he said, holding the door, and, at the moment it closed, with her still screaming outside, I saw, for the first time in a long time, the man I had created, not the fragile boy, not the submissive husband, but the man who finally broke free. He pressed his forehead against the closed door and began to cry. Not a cry of weakness, but a cry of liberation that I approached slowly. I touched his back. He turned and fell onto my shoulder, just like when he was 8 years old. I held him, with all the strength a mother saves only for the most decisive moments in life. And little did he know that the worst was yet to come, because the past he thought belonged to her was about to come knocking at our door. 2 days had passed since my son slammed the door in Emily's face. The house was still permeated by that strange silence of reorganization, as if each room was adjusting to her absence. My son walked slowly through the hallways, unhurried, like someone relearning to breathe after a long time living without air. Sometimes I found him sitting on the sofa, staring into nothingness. Other times I saw him in the kitchen, stirring tea without drinking it. He was rebuilding himself. And rebuilding is always silent. The truth is, I was adjusting too. Not to the end of their marriage. I'd already seen that crumble before he even realized it, but to the fact that my son was finally free. free from manipulation, free from control, free from years of emotional abuse masked as love. And for the first time in a long time, I saw him as the man he was always meant to be. But freedom sometimes brings truths that arrive too late. And ours was still on its way. On the morning of the second day, while I was making coffee, a lighter, sweeter coffee, almost symbolic after everything, the house phone rang. I found it strange. Almost no one called that number. My son was in the shower. I thought about letting it ring, but something about the insistent, sharp sound made me answer. Hello. On the other end of the line, a male voice replied, dry and direct. Is this from Emily's house? My heart skipped a beat. Who's speaking? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause. It's Raphael. The lover's name. The hand holding the phone went cold. A wave of indignation mixed with a bitter taste rose in my throat. The man continued. I'm looking for her. Do you know where she is? She hasn't answered my calls since yesterday. His audacity shocked me so much that I needed a few seconds to process it. He spoke as if he had every right to know, as if he were the husband, as if he were the one who had been betrayed, as if no destruction had been left behind. I took a deep breath, but my voice came out laden with a control I didn't even know I possessed. Emily doesn't live here anymore, and I think you should know exactly why. Silence. She said something about me, he asked hesitantly. He said it all without needing to say anything. And I hung up. When I turned around, my son was standing in the doorway, pale. He'd heard enough. The pain returned to his face, not the pain of betrayal, but the pain of realizing that Emily had not only deceived him, but that she had another man who now pursued her as if she belonged to him. That was the final blow, the absolute confirmation of what he was still trying to deny deep down. He walked slowly to the table, sat down without saying anything, and rested his elbows on his knees. She wasn't a victim of anything, was she, Mom? I sat down next to him. No, my son. It never was. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if that sentence had released something too heavy to carry alone. The rest of the day passed in silence. A different kind of silence, no longer suffocating, but clean, almost therapeutic. The house seemed larger. The light entered differently. As if, finally, we could breathe without the constant weight of her gaze, her shouts, her manipulations. But there was something deeper inside me, something I only realized when I went to prepare my own cup. I opened the cupboard and took out the same cup she had used to throw coffee at me. I looked at it for a few seconds. The white porcelain, the thin rim, the discreet design. I never thought that such a small object could carry so much history, so much pain, and so much liberation. I washed the cup slowly, with gentle, almost symbolic movements. I filled it with fresh coffee, and I felt for the first time in a long time peace as I held it. I sat down at the table, brought the cup to my lips, and took the first sip.
Calm, warm,
sweet, and, for the first time since Emily came into our lives, I felt like my son was with me again, the boy I raised, the man he became, his soul finally free. She thought throwing coffee on me would shut me up, but it was precisely the coffee that spilled the whole truth. Today, when I look back, I realize that the worst betrayal is never the one that hurts the body, it's the one that tries to silence our spirit, and I almost let that happen to me that I almost lost my son to a well-told lie. But life always gives signs, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, and in my case, in a cup of coffee thrown with hatred. You know, my son asked me the other day, Mom, how could I let this happen? And I replied with the only true thing I learned from that story. No one is blind by choice. We only see when pain opens the eyes that love tried to close. And now I ask you, have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever loved someone who hurt you while claiming to protect you? Have you noticed a toxic pattern too late? Or worse, have you ever had to watch a child, a friend, a loved one trapped in a relationship that only existed to destroy them? Comment below. Sometimes, telling your own story is the first step towards freeing yourself from it. And if you want more stories like this, real, profound, and full of lessons. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This helps me immensely to continue sharing stories that many people experience, but few have the courage to tell. Thank you for listening, and remember, no one has the right to silence your voice. Not with a cup of coffee, not with any lie.